your patience on that. And without further ado, I give you two gentlemen that presented a little bit earlier today. Hopefully you caught them talking about IPA for HCM. Mr. Jeremy Stoltzfus, Mr. Jeff House, very passionate about IPA, love working with the product, and have a great presentation here for you today. Thank you very much, guys.
Right, thank you. Don't forget, you got to come back up and do the About RPI, so don't get too comfortable. Yeah. He likes to sit down. It's after lunch. He had a good one. All right, so welcome. Thank you all for joining. We have some good stuff planned on the agenda today. Hopefully we cover some of the topics that you've wanted to know about, maybe want to know a little bit, get a little bit more depth on with our agenda. The last one that we have on there is reason codes, that if we have time, we will get to it. We covered it in the HCM session. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with interfaces, but it does get frequently asked by a lot of customers, especially on the S3 side, and how do I use reason codes in my user automation or in my approval in basket type stuff.
All right, and talk a brief second about RPI. Most of you probably are already familiar with us. If you're not, we are a full-service Lawson consulting partner. Welcome you to come check us out on our website at the FLUG meeting on Friday, or at Infor coming up in July. Large technical team, a lot of which is pictured here today, including Mr. Stoltzfus and Mr. House, and be happy to help you with any upcoming needs with your Infor Lawson system you may have.
All right, so the first one, this is an exciting topic. Gosh, I was so excited when this came out on IPA.
Yeah, actually, thinking back to Process Flow Integrator version 9, where this function kind of existed. It was kind of clunky, and you had to set up a whole bunch of stuff. And I had worked at a customer site previously, and we actually set up a big, complicated flow to essentially do this. But channels and receivers is a great feature of process automation for interface engines. It basically allows you to set up those channels, and a channel is really just kind of a monitored source. So as we talk about a monitor source, that could be a directory on your LSF server, it could be a directory on your landmark server, or it could be anything remote that you can reach via FTP or SFTP. Of course, with a username and password connected to those sites, so it's a secure connection to that. So you set up that channel, and basically that's that place where those files will then get put. And this is primarily used as an input to your Lawson system method.
So you can think of a channel as a directory on a server. It can either be the local directory on your landmark server, where if you can drop a file on the landmark server, then this channel is going to pick up that file and do something with it, process it. It may just be an entry point into your flow. That file may have some important data in it as well that you want to pick up and process. So local means the landmark server. I drop a file in a specific location on my landmark server, and poof, a flow kicks off for every file that drops. Now, one of the things or a couple things that you do have to set up whenever you have a channel, whether it be local or remote, I'll talk about remote in just a moment, is you do have to set up an error and an in progress directory for each channel. Now, you can reuse the same ones if you want, or you can set up different ones depending on the structure, maybe how much volume is coming in, names of your files, all of those types of things that could affect how these directories work. But essentially, if you think about having a progress directory and an error directory, is I'm going to drop a file in d:/interface. That file, the channel is looking at it. Do I have a file? Do I have a file? Do I have a file? And then when it says, yes, I found a file, it needs to move that somewhere else, because guess what's going to come up behind it? Do I have a file? Do I have a file? Do I have a file? So you don't want it to keep picking up the exact same file that you're trying to process. That's the purpose of the in progress directory. The error directory generally means if there was a problem moving that file. If I'm taking a file from d:/interface and I'm going to move it to in progress, but maybe that file is open somewhere that you didn't know about. Maybe it was editing and you saved it there, and you were working in Excel and Excel has the lock on it. Well, guess what? File can't be moved. So therefore, it's going to go to the error directory for you to process. Now, the remote channel is going to be any server that you have FTP or SFTP connectivity to. So as long as your landmark server, key point, can connect to that FTP server, you can. A lot of people use it for LSF. They can drop a file on the LSF server, pick it up, and then the file needs to move to the landmark server. Keep that in mind. So even though you're going to pick up something on your remote server, it's going to transfer to landmark into that progress directory.
Right, so that in progress directory will always refer to the local landmark server, despite the fact that your channel may be set up remotely.
Yes. And another question that gets frequently asked about channels is, can I use file shares? And the answer is no. Can I use map drives? And the answer is no. You can only use FTP and SFTP if you're going to connect to a remote server, at least at this moment. I'm not sure if that's a future enhancement. But some people have a little aversion to FTP, I've noticed. So now we've talked about a channel. Your channel is your directory. Now inside of your channel, you can have one or more receivers. Receivers are your files. You can have wildcards. You can have GL transrel asterisk. You can have just asterisk to pull up any file that's in that directory, or you may be looking for one specific file. So therefore, within your channel, your directory, you can have one or more receivers depending on how the names of the files that are dropping in as to which flow you want to kick off.
A good application of this is if you have an inbound folder set up on your landmark server, so it's a local channel set up on your landmark server that you have, maybe that's on your network that multiple systems, maybe external systems from your Infor Lawson system, may be interfacing data in. So financial data, employee, new hire data, or anything external to your Lawson system. You have one channel that's set up and everybody just drops files in. So the receivers allow you to specifically look for a specific file based on that file name that gets dropped into that folder. And once that file then gets dropped, the receiver is where you map the specific process to that matching file name that comes in. Now, you'll see here that you have different options for actually processing that file now. The first option is file name, and that passes just the name of the file. Keep in mind that will be the name of the file in the in progress directory. So once it's picked up and passed off to the flow, that file has already been moved to that in progress directory. So it just passes the name of the file. It's then up to your flow to open that file and read through the data that's in that file. Second option is file data, and what that will do is take the entire contents of that data, of that file, and load it into memory. Depending on the size of your file, that may or may not be a good option, but what it does enable you to do is then in your flow, you don't have to worry about opening the file, reading the file, you just have that set of data. So maybe it's just one record that's coming in, or just a couple fields of data that you're processing and bringing in. That's the file data option. The file line option then takes just a little bit down a notch from the file data, and instead of processing or pulling in the entire contents of the file, it will actually launch a pass line by line to process. So it will kick off a new work unit for that process for every line in the file. So again, something you just kind of have to consider. If your file is 10,000 lines long, that may not be the best option because you're going to kick off 10,000 work units with that particular option. Again, so that's kind of evaluate on a case-by-case basis. Of course, the advantage there is you don't have to build into the flow the logic to loop through the file. Or maybe you're getting a file of just a small handful of records and they all have to go through approval flows or something like that. So that option is there for you to use.
So another thing about when we deal with channels, and a lot of frustration has happened with it, is when I'm in my designer, I'm not able to use my control space whenever I'm dealing with a channel to get my variables. But every work unit that's triggered from a channel does create 6 variables for us automatically. The most commonly used ones are processed file directory and file name, because that's the concatenation of those 2 fields gives us the path to where our file that we need to pick up is located. So one of the things you can do to get around this limitation is you can set yourself up a dummy service. The service is really never going to get called, but if you create it and then add those channel variables to the service, and then in your designer just tie your flow to that service, now all of a sudden your control space is going to work properly and you'll be able to pick up those variables, making your life as an IPA developer just a little bit easier. I mean, you can always still use the less than, exclamation point, greater than, and type process file directory file name. You get used to it after a while, but in the beginning, it might be good to have those variables handy. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit of optimization on how to optimize your interfaces using IPA. IPA is, of course, can be used as an interface engine, but sometimes it does have certain limitations, and of course not every scenario is built to use IPA as an interface engine. You might need to use something a little bit more powerful. But we're going to walk through 2 different examples. We'll start with an example in S3, and then we'll do one in more of the newer landmark applications as well. So in S3, let's say I have this scenario where I'm going to import 10,000 records into GL Transrel. I'm doing journal entry interfacing, a very common use of IPA interfaces. I'm going to walk through 4 different ways that you can develop this flow, and then we'll look at the timings of each one and how how you code your flow can drastically affect the performance. So the first one, our natural instinct is to use the data iterator. The data iterator really does have a lot of a lot of great things about it. But if you think about what a data iterator is doing, is for every line and for every field in a file, a node has to get executed. So we have to start that process up, start up again. And while these are milliseconds add up when you're dealing with thousands and thousands of records. So the first example here shows you if you read a file line by line and then parsed the file field by field and then just did a typical branch and moved stuff out into variables and then populated it with a GL65 transaction to add the record. 10,000 of them. We'll see how long it took in a minute. Second one, JavaScript parsing. Instead of doing all of this with the flow, what we do is we just take that whole loop construct of parsing out the line by field and just write our own JavaScript. We can do that. We can do all kinds of, we can do loops, we can do switch case, anything. And I do get asked frequently about JavaScript, and the best thing to do is to just play with it. Search the internet, learn JavaScript, learn basic JavaScript. It will make your IPA flows run a lot more efficiently if you can use JavaScripting. Third one, we're going to do an import DB into GL Transrel. So we have a file that's not formatted for GL Transrel. Some places have that automatically, making this process a lot easier. But we don't. We have a file where somebody said, no, I will not give that to you in that format. It's going to be this format. That's what we're doing here. So we import in where we transform the file, and then we use a system command to import DB on the LSF server. The next one, what we're going to do is we're going to transfer the file that we picked up with the channel to our database server, and then we're going to use a bulk insert to insert it into a temporary table. Then we'll run some SQL statements on that and insert directly into GL Transrel. Now remember, a file like this is meant to be an interface file. You don't want to do this with like the employee table or anything like that, something that's live. GL Transrel is meant as an interface table which can be easily purged. So a little disclaimer there.
And of course, considerations with that, obviously, if you're a cloud customer, you're not going to have access to your database and be able to do this type of activity, but it is available for on-premise.
Correct. And then the other thing with whenever we use these nodes, these JDBC nodes, we're executing them individually. So if we used, a temp table as we would in like the SQL Server Management Studio, it's going to behave differently because that's all within one session, whereas this is going to cross over. I haven't figured that one out yet, I'll be honest. All right, so let's look at the timings of all 4 of these things and what happened. So our data iterator, that very first thing we saw, when I built this and ran it, it took over 4 hours to get 10,000 records interfaced into GL65. That's not acceptable. Using my JavaScript, I reduced it down to an hour. That's a pretty substantial savings. But now, if I'm using my JavaScript and import DB, I got it down to about 3 minutes. And then when I used the database directly, it took 3 seconds. So play with your flows and see if you can come up with some out-of-the-box, sorry cliche, ways of getting the same thing done, but just a little bit different. The rewards, as you can see by this graphic, are substantial.
And before you move on, I should actually clarify my last statement about cloud customers. In future releases of Landmark and Process Automation, they are adding some abilities to make some calls, specifically on Landmark side, not the S3 side, but to allow you to do those import activities via a dedicated node in Process Automation. So that is something that is coming with future release of Landmark.
That's wonderful.
So we talked about, Jeff was talking about inbound interfaces, so let's talk a little bit about outbound interfaces. So this example that I have right here is actually creating the file an output file, so reading data from your Lawson system and writing a file. So it's actually doing it in 3 different ways. And we've got the breakdown here. So I'm going to start actually with the one in the middle, which starts right here. And basically that's querying your Lawson data, so it could be anything. It could be GL, it could be employees, and it's maybe pulling 10,000 records, however many records are in your query, and then it's looping through that query one at a time, writing each line out to that file. So as you can imagine, file I/O, as programmers were told, file I/O is always very expensive operation. So that's going to be a significant time consuming process. If you look at the top line here, what that's doing is actually doing that query, but instead of writing it out to a file as it's reading through each record, it's actually writing it to a message builder node. So it's writing it to in-process memory. And then once it's done processing all the records, it then does one file write and writes it out to the file. The bottom option is kind of an extension of that. So you may have 10,000, 20,000 records that you're querying and you're pulling out of your system that you're writing. So maybe it's a full employee dump. And depending on how many employees you have in your organization, that could be a pretty large file. So there's always a trade-off. So it's consuming memory resources on the system as it's processing. One way to balance the two is basically to set up a loop where set up an index count, basically. So as you're looping through, maybe every 100 records you're doing one file write, as opposed to 100 records, one write for every record. So it's a way to control the size of memory that's being used to process all of that data. So, and you can play around with the timing using variables as your cutoff point. And then of course at the end you want to do a final check to see where you ended up to make sure you flush out any additional items that might still be in memory. So I don't have all the timing for this, but you can tell that the in-memory processing is going to be a lot faster than processing one record at a time and writing that file every time through your loop. I want to talk a little bit about web services. So we've been talking a lot about writing files, but another way to interface data out of your system and even inputting data into your system as well is actually make calls into web services. Now web services would be more of a real-time transactional type interface. So this is an example from a global HR application, actually from the talent acquisition module, where candidates apply for a job and then the recruiters want to initiate, say, a background check screening process. So set this up for a client where the the background check was initiated by a third-party vendor. The third-party vendor had on their site, their external site, some exposed web services where you could actually pass data through a secure HTTPS connection into their web services. So the flow went through and collected data about that candidate and then formatted it into an XML format and then made one web service call here at the end to just pass that data through a SOAP call, basically, and pass that. So that's kind of a real-time transactional interface, but it's something that is available to you today and through the web services node.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about user account automation. And we get asked this very, very frequently about how can I use IPA to manage adding, creating, and removing users from my system. So we know right now, as it exists for most of us, we have two systems. We have LSF and we have Landmark. And we need to use ISS to add our user, or to maintain our users in order to keep these two systems synchronized. In LSF, we have our resource. In Landmark, we call that an actor. In LSF, we have both of them have the SSOP or SSOP v2 identities for logging in. It depends on which one you set as the primary authenticator, whether you're using LSF or Landmark. In LSF, if I use employee self-service, I need to make sure I have my employee identity. In Landmark, I also have to make sure that any identity that I add, that I assign it to the actor. And then, of course, I'm adding my security roles. All of these things we're doing with ISS, and they're all done automatically for us. It's wonderful. But doing 100 people coming in at an orientation with ISS is a little bit of data entry. So how can we do it with IPA? So what we end up having to do is create a flow, something like this, where maybe we have a file and we drop it on a channel and it's a receiver and we pick it up and then we process this flow that'll take care of those users. We know the users that are going to come into our system. We can also query the system, put this on a scheduler, however it is that we work with our business. So I'm going to walk through this flow just a little bit of what it's doing. So for each line, I have a little bit of an update to HR11, maybe take some pertinent data. This is based on a file. I'm going to look at the RM record in LSF to find out, does it exist? If it does, then I need to update this resource. Maybe they had a name change, but their ID still stays the same. Maybe their email address changed. Their security roles that they had before, maybe they were a core user, now they're coming back as just an employee. I don't know, but let's start over from scratch. And we'll update it. If I don't, then let me add the resource to RM, just like we did back in the old days. I'm old. So now, let's get down to the Landmark piece. What are we going to do? Very similar thing. Let's use a Landmark transaction and we'll check the actor. Find out, does the actor exist? If it doesn't, or no matter what, actually what I'm doing here is taking this actor and then I'm passing in either an update or a create action to it. So therefore, I'm going to either update an existing actor or add a new actor, since we have the ability to do that with our Landmark transaction. Makes it a little better. And then enable the actor in case it was disabled before. I'll create their SSOP identity if it doesn't exist. That's here, and then I'll assign the identity to that particular actor. Down here, find all of their old Landmark security roles, delete them, and then add only the new ones that I want. So all of these things go into kind of creating a new user from scratch. Now terminations, you'd have to create maybe something a little bit different for that to do your disabling. Everybody has their own policy. Anything to add?
Touched on this earlier in our earlier presentation this morning, but along with the roles and all of that, a good interface is maintaining your users once they've been created. And so you know about your employees, you know if they're a supervisor, you know what department they're in, so you can automate that role assignment based on job code or position in the organization.
Now, one of the things that ends up happening in some instances is I go through and I use my flow to add a user to RM, and then also add a user to Landmark, and then I go into ISS to do some maintenance, and lo and behold, the person's not there. And that happens sometimes. ISS uses a different search index than RM or Actor over in Landmark. So I can add the user, I can see it in loss and security, I can see it in my rich client under the Actor, but in ISS there's nothing. And that's because we either have to do a sync, which that kind of can be painful at times, or we can also just rebuild our search index. So in SSO config on the LSF side, what we're going to do is go down to Manage Search Index. And what we want to try to do is do a refresh server index. If we can do that, then that might have the user appear. If it doesn't, then we can do a build resource full index. This can take a little bit of time, so use caution with it. But that will get our user to show up in LSF without having to do restarts of WebSphere, restarts of the environment, or have to perform a sync. Up in the top right, we have the KB article that references this information if you'd like to read up on it further.
So as we talk about interfaces, of course, we're not just interfacing data within your own organization, so other systems, but potentially external to your organization. So benefit providers, bank information for payroll or accounts payable, things like that. So we want to talk about encryption a little bit, because just because you create a file and send it over via FTP or SFTP, there's still more that you can do, and some benefit providers I know require encrypted files, or will send you an encrypted file, and will also give you that decryption key so that you can accommodate that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. There are 2 nodes specifically in process automation that allow you to do that.
Right, and everybody's probably seen the encrypt and decrypt nodes in there and wonder, how in the world do I use this thing? I'd kind of like to use it. So here are the 2 scenarios that you have. At this moment, everything works with PGP. So let's say that you have something that you're going to send outbound. You're going to send something to your benefit provider. We'll just say Aetna for no plug, just that's what came to mind. So they have given you a public key that you can encrypt your data with. So what you're going to end up having to do is on your Landmark server, you're going to import that public key as a service, and then when you run that encrypt node, it's going to encrypt the contents that you pass to it into a file. Then you can take that file and send that encrypted file to your benefit provider. They have a private key on their server that they're going to decode that value that you sent. Now, if you are going to decrypt something into your Landmark system from an outside source, you have to give them, oops, I didn't mean to hit the mic. You have to give them a private key, which means a public key, which means you have to generate your own private key from Landmark. So therefore, what I'm going to have to do on my Landmark server is get my own private key, and then take the public key from that private key and give it to my benefit provider. How do we do all this? It's not that hard. That sounds really confusing, but it's not. So if we look at a service, now this is not an IPA service, but this is an actual service such as SSOP or something along those lines. So we're going to be in the gen data area, very important in our rich client. I've created a fictional benefits provider called Benefits Plus. It just sounded good. And we're going to have an example of an inbound and an outbound. So you're going to have to initially set this part of the service up in your rich client. That should be all you have to do, is set up these few parameters to get it done. we're going to use the secadmin command line utility in Landmark. So if we go into secadmin and then we go to key management, that's where we're going to deal with both of these. And so now if I'm going to have something coming in, then I've been given a public key from my benefit provider, Aetna. They've said, here you go. Here's your public key. This is what you're going to encrypt. You're going to decrypt data that we have sent to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to upload the PGP public key that they've given to me. It's going to have to exist on my Landmark server. This screen over here is just an example of what it looks like. A bunch of gobbledygook. Not too hard. Now, in IPA, oh, I'm sorry, this is encrypted. I see, even I get inbound and outbound confused with all these keys. So this is going to be something I'm sending to Aetna. That's right. It's not inbound. This is outbound. So I might have this all mixed up. So I take the contents, the unencrypted contents, and then run it through this particular service, and then I end up getting an encrypted message down here that I can send to my benefit provider. Yes, yes. All right. Now, outbound from Landmark, I need to generate a PGP key pair and then download the public key that I can give to somebody else, that they can use that public key to encrypt the data so I can decrypt it in Landmark. Decrypt node, same thing. I'm going to use my service. And then down here, my output data will give me the unencrypted contents based on the key that I have. Not too bad. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about dealing with setting up these services is when you're federated, services do try to sync. So your best bet is to use a list-based service sync. Take away all the stuff that you don't necessarily need, especially these services. These services may end up causing you some problems if you try to sync them after adding them to Landmark into LSF. In fact, in some of my testing, I even corrupted my LSF LDAP, and I had to go in and finagle it. It wasn't very fun. So just be careful with that if when you do set this up. Plus, you don't want all that. You can see here I have two systems. I have a GHR system and an LSF system. My LSF system doesn't need to know about all of those TM services. I don't need to know candidates that are coming across to me as well. So this is a whole separate conversation about ISS sync, but all right.
Triggers. So when we talk about process flows, and there's all kinds of ways to trigger them. We talked about channels and receivers a little bit, but there's also the service definitions and there's schedules and things like that.
So a service exists in both GHR and in traditional S3. A lot of them are delivered by the application. Rec approval is a prime example for anything released in RQ10 in Lawson. We have plenty of them in some of our action requests and whatever are going to be over in GHR. You can also create your own service too, like we were showing a little bit earlier with the channel. That would be creating a service even though it wouldn't be used. And then we have the ability to trigger something using that service if we so desire. In the old S3 world, a service was really used a lot by the applications. And that IPA Services for Lawson told us which applications we could use to trigger process flow, which of course turned into IPA. Down here we have this load grant service that we're going to manually trigger. For instance, this is something that I've done recently where we've had grant management, and grant accounting templates, or grant accountants were creating templates, and then they needed to trigger the process saying, hey, I'm done, I have this ready to go. They couldn't do it with a file channel, but let's start some of this other automation. How do I get it to start? So first step is let's create a service, and then we'll show you different ways that you can start that service. So every service needs to be anytime you're going to run a service from either the scheduler or start it on the server or trigger it with the web call, you have to create a trigger on the how do I say that? We just got
process trigger.
There we go. We just have to create a service or a process trigger. Got tripped over my own words there. Sorry. So, so a service is different than a process. A service has a process tied to it, but a process does not necessarily have to run under a service. You can trigger either. Over here on the right in the post-it notes is an example of how you could trigger this with a web call. How you can call IPA with a URL. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight in here was the 5B and 5D, escaping out the brackets. Because in the user guide, there are pieces that tell you to just use a backslash and then that character, or just use that character. And in my experience, that it's thrown it off and it wouldn't work. So anytime you deal with a URL, use the hex value.
So another important feature is the schedule. There are definitely times when you're going to want to just schedule something, and typically you would see this with outbound interfaces. We talked about the channels and receivers, and that's a great way to process incoming files. But there are certainly times once a week, maybe you create a daily file, something like that needs to be generated and sent out to some external source. So you come in, you create a process trigger, and then you schedule that process trigger or service trigger, and then you schedule that. And that's just a matter of right-clicking on the record and choosing schedule. There's all kinds of advanced scheduling options, daily, monthly, weekly. You can pick the days of the month, you can pick the weeks. The way, something that comes up frequently is, okay, how do I process something every other week for maybe after my payroll's done processing? I know that every week at Wednesday, 10 p.m., payroll's done processing. So I want to process this file every other week. So there's an option to also process by frequency in seconds, where you can set the initial time for that to be your 10 p.m. Wednesday night, and then you just need to calculate the number of seconds for 2 weeks, and then it'll execute that every 2 weeks.
You can make your algebra teacher proud.
Yeah.
So a way that we can trigger the service from S3, for instance, that grant accountant scenario, is we can go back to the old WFWK screen. Sounds like a radio station, but it's a screen that is an entry point into IPA. You can trigger a flow. As you can see, the screen is it's full, like a lot of Lawson screens. That's a politically correct way of putting it. It does not have any drop downs on it either, so you do have to free text type everything into this screen, including the variables. That variable name screen that you see over here is free text. You can't just hit the drop down and find out what variables are tied to that service. So this screen might be a little bit intimidating for your users to execute, but it does work. Now, if you really want to get snazzy, you can bust out the old Design Studio. I'm probably one of the biggest proponents of this product of anybody. I loved it, and it was so underutilized. We could turn that last ugly screen you saw right into this. So that way the user, all they have to do is enter the process date, click the add button, life is good, process triggers. They don't have to see all that behind the scenes stuff. We can execute a little bit of JavaScript, make their life a lot easier.
Does it trigger a dust storm whenever?
It does trigger a dust storm. And before the little thing came on, there's a person that's walking in the dust storm. I really feel for that person walking with that bucket on that dirt road. That really doesn't look like a good place to be. They're going to get hit with the hind.
All right, so we talked a lot about process development and how we can make sure our process flows are written in such a way that they're going to be optimized for performance and speed and all the different things we can do there. There is some stuff, if you're an on-premise customer, you have access to the Landmark grid, where you can actually do some tuning and adjustments to make sure that your Landmark system is running as optimal as possible. So one of the default configurations when you install Landmark is to combine, and this is a shot of the grid, and each of the lines here are different nodes within your grid, and when you install some of the default configurations, depending on what size you picked, we'll combine some of these nodes together into one node. So you've got multiple applications running in one JVM. So that doesn't always give you the best performance. So as we look at this screenshot with the async and the two LPA nodes circled here, you see those two typically will come delivered together in a Landmark deferred node. And optimally, you want to separate those to make sure that LPA is really running in its own space, so that it's separated from stuff that's happening in async, and it just allows more resources. Now, obviously this is dependent on the resources available in your hardware, your server, or your VM to be able to do this, because this is additional memory, this is additional threads running on your system, so all of those things need to be considered. Here in this particular example, you can see that there's two LPA nodes, and one is for a standalone S3 instance of LPA, and the other one is for a GHR instance of LPA. So within Landmark applications, each application has really its own process flow, unique work unit numbers, and all of that. So the way you do that is to go through and you configure that data area binding, and that's all done. You can see the path through the configuration utility. You can see the path across the top through the configuration manager to get to that. And you pick out those LPA nodes. You have to first create the binding for a second binding for an LPA application, and you name it uniquely. And then you go through and you specify which data area gets assigned to which node. I like to name the node according to which data area is being bound to it, just for clarity, so you can see at a high level what's going on. The other thing we have the ability to do is adjust the core pool size. So what this is so you look at that LPA node, and LPA default out of the box, this core pool size specifies how many active processes the process flow server or the process automation server will actively work on at any given time. So this does not include work units that are sitting in someone's in basket or sitting in a wait state, so a wait node in your process flow. Those things are suspended and not consuming one of those resources, but the default value for this is 2. So if you're a large organization running many processes, and you may have hundreds of rec approvals that get initiated a day, and there's just a lot of activity. Large organization running global HR is going to have a lot of action requests running through, and you want to increase these numbers. And again, it's a trade-off. So the higher the number, the more threads, the more memory you're going to need. But it does give you more throughput of your system to allow processing. In this particular example, I set the one data area LPA node to 4 and the other one to 6. So each of those nodes would then be able to process that many work units simultaneously.
And one thing I wanted to add about the wait node too is that I don't remember which CU it came out, but with a wait node you have the ability to, of course, pause a process for a period of time, but now you have the ability to either send that flow into a non-processing state or leave it actively process. And the reason that that's significant is that whenever you send your flow to sleep, in other words, waiting on a user action or paused, you flush out all of your variables that are in memory. For instance, if you've done a landmark transaction or you've done a Lawson S3 query, those variables sit in memory unless you do an assign, and then they're committed. So if you use a user action or a wait node where you stop actively processing, those variables are no longer available to you, the ones that came from the transactions. So if you only need to pause for a couple seconds, you can leave that flow actively processed so you don't lose those variables that are sitting in memory.
Yeah, and the key thing there, he said, was a couple of seconds, because again, the longer you have that wait node sitting there, it's consuming one of these available core pool size, one of these dispatchers, basically. So that's reducing the number of then active processes that your system can process. So it's, again, a trade-off. Java heap size is another critical piece. So Landmark is all Java-based, of course. And you want to really keep an eye on these things. So this is monitoring your grid and just checking out the Java heap to make sure you're not maxing out on memory in any particular node. You start maxing out on memory, you hit 85, things start 85%, 90%, things start shutting down, restarting, users get disconnected, users get frustrated, things aren't running. So there's a lot to do here to keep your Java heap in size. General rule of thumb is to keep your Java heap utilization between like 60 and 70%. That seems to be a good trade-off. You don't want to obviously size up your Java heap way larger than you need, because then the garbage collection takes a lot longer to clean up and do its thing. So there's definitely some tuning here that can be done. And this is just going through ongoing monitoring of your system. Another feature that was released in an older CU, but still in 10.1.1 of IPA, was connection pooling. So you're looping through, let's say you're looping through an input file. And in each line through that input file, you're calling a transaction. Maybe you're doing a journal entry upload. And so you're writing that GL entry out via a loss and transaction node. So each time through that loop, it has to open and establish that connection to your S3 transaction, to your iOS layer. With connection pooling, it actually saves that connection, retains that connection, it remains open on the server, and it's sitting there available for process automation to use. So there's some guidance on what values you should be using to set here. But there's all these different properties that allow you to say, okay, here's the maximum number of active connections that I'm going to allow, and then the minimum size. So you're always going to have at least 3 connections open and things like that. And how long do I wait before I shut down active connections to keep things in check? And remember, this is just, again, consuming more resources on your system. So it's the kind of continual ongoing tuning. So that's available for both SQL connections, so direct SQL connections to your database, and for the S3 connections as well.
Cool. So I'm going to take just a moment and talk about using reason codes in S3. And as I said in the beginning, this doesn't really have anything to do with interfaces, but it is asked, and it's something that's fairly recent in terms of Landmark CU updates. And it's worth it to get this information out to as many people as we can. So a lot of people for S3 would build their user action nodes. This is for something going to a user for approval, requiring an in-basket or email approval. And then they would select this show reason code pop-up. That sounds good to me. I want people to input a reason code comment as to why they're rejecting this requisition or this personnel action. But then the reason subject is blank. Well, how in the world do I get that populated? Because I can't use it without a subject. So what you can do is you can use the configuration console, and then you add a subject to the data area. This is a fully supported thing. In this case, we're just going to add one subject, because subjects are built more for the GHR application, and the S3 application really doesn't have this functionality built in, but we can still use it. So we'll add our subject, and then there we go. Our subject appears in our user connection node, or our user interaction node, and now we can at least get past this. So now if we want to use reason codes, we can use the rich client, and add one or more reason codes if we so desire. Here's how you get to it, and then here's all you need to do to set up a specific reason code that the user would see in their reason code drop-down box based on this subject. So if you want more subjects and then tie different reason codes to it, that's no problem as well. Set it up however you see fit. But one of the things that people really like most is the free text comment. So what will end up happening is, well, first I have to make sure that I have, if I'm going to use email, then, and this does work, by the way, so whenever somebody gets an email, they click the reject button, and then it's going to give them a web page where they can enter their comments. And then here's something that a procurement requisition that I get for a user, and then when they click the reject button, then I can specify a reason code and or a message that I can now capture, send back to the requester, or store anywhere I want to. So good stuff, easy setup, nice quick win if you want to get that out to your users. So now we're ready to talk about some, you get to see Keith again.
Real quick, I promise to make it brief right before we get to questions, which we have several that we're going to ask. Just want to talk about this IPA Symposium, which is something we're just starting to plan. It is going to be a collaboration and educational session for IPA developers and other folks interested in IPA. I know that Jeremy and Jeff are very excited, as are Richard Stout, Chip Cunningham, and we're looking to gauge interest out there. These webinars are by far the most well-attended every single time we do the webinars, and we know that a lot of you have tremendous amounts of expertise, and what we want to do is try to get that in a setting where you guys can share that with the rest of the community and build out that network, and obviously we'd be happy to participate on that. What we're looking at is scheduling this right after the Southeast Mega Meeting, which is in Charlotte, North Carolina, at the Hilton Charlotte University Place from September Sunday 17th to the 19th. We will make it right there. So any of you attending the Southeast Mega Meeting can stick around an extra day and get a day of fun-filled IPA. You don't have to be a part of the Southeast Mega to attend it. And our understanding from the Southeast Mega is they welcome anyone that's interested. It's a great meeting, very cost efficient, great thing to look at in general. As far as the format, we're looking to collect feedback in terms of any contributors. Out there, we are looking to share things that people have done and are considering maybe bringing some sandboxes into play and doing some interactive stuff. We really want to try to push the envelope and do something really cool, so we hope that you will support us and participate in this. And with that, let me go read some questions for our presenters.
We learn from you as much as
Definitely.
you learn from us.
Definitely.
I've seen some people out there do some really, really cool stuff that I would have never thought of. So.
That's how we learn. So let me, some of these are questions, some of these are comments, and I'll try to read them mostly in order here. And if we go long,
I can go long.
We can go long, obviously. Those of you, if you stick around, we'll try to answer all these. So first I have, this is going all the way back to channels and receivers. Do the file channels work well with integration engines such as Rhapsody? I don't know what Rhapsody is, so.
Boy, I remember Rhapsody as a music service. That really shows my age.
Yeah, there you go.
So if Rhapsody is able to pick up a file, or to drop a file off, so the channels and receivers are an inbound interface function. So if Rhapsody is able to drop a file off, then yes, any service that's able to drop that file into that location.
Okay, cool. And then I have here, this is a comment that I guess, there might be an aversion to FTP out there. FTP is not a secure transfer method that exposes credential. SFTP does not have the issues. Most people still associate FTP with SFTP.
And that's true. And I've just seen that some server administrators are like, I don't want to enable any FTP services on my server. Can you please send it to me in a file share? And then that poses the problem of us giving somebody the guide and saying these are the supported methods. If you can get me the file over on the landmark server, life is good. You can use a file share, drop it on. But if I have to connect somewhere else, I do have to have FTP. But I agree with you. I don't think there's anything wrong with enabling SFTP.
Especially with the encryption methods that we talked about.
Exactly. But I mean, it's just a hurdle that we have to jump over sometimes.
All right, so this one is more of a puzzle for you guys. I
Oh
think.
boy.
So how do you handle the existence of a file that already exists in the process directory? Meaning, file is received, moved to in-process directory, it stands waiting to be picked up, a second file is sent, first file has not been processed. What happens with the first and second files? Overwrite timestamps?
So if that first file is actively being processed, and by the fact that it was moved to that in progress, it more than likely is being processed, the system will actually have a lock on the file, and then it will prevent that file, the new file, from overwriting the existing file, and that will get written to the errors directory then at that point.
And then of course you can always check for existence of a file before you process. So at the end of your channel receiver files, you could always take the file that you finished from progress and move it to archive. That's usually a good practice too. Date stamp it, or maybe even your first node. Take that file, rename it with a date and time stamp. So that way, in case something else does come in, that date and time stamp is going to be unique.
So here's a question that I think we may have addressed in the presentation, but I'm going to ask it anyway.
Sure.
And maybe if we just refer to it. Gentleman tried to write an IPA interface that grabbed 24,000 employee records. Pulled some PG employee, PA employee data for each one. Self-accumulated data into a record in a CSV output file and was done. Took a couple of hours to run an IPA. When they did it as 4GL, it ran in 5 minutes. Is that normal? Something could be done about it.
Depends on how you do it. If you can use direct SQL and you can formulate that data and maybe write it into a temp table and then have your database just bulk export it out to a file, you're going to run a lot faster.
Using the system command node, if you have access to your database server, you can use the system command node to dump. I know SQL Server has a straight up command to just generate a CSV file from a query. So those options are always available.
I got more. I'm going to keep going here.
Keep going.
In the adding user accounts section of your presentation, in your IPA example, what is being used as the RMID in security?
As the RMID, well, it would be whatever ID that you want to add for that particular user.
So generally you would see that that type of interface coming in as an input file, and that RMID may be included in that file, or maybe it's just employee and it's generated off of that, or maybe it's generated off of the name or a combination of such of those items too.
But just remember that your RMID and your actor must be the same, because they technically
need to be in
are
sync.
the same thing. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, let me know if these aren't answering. I'm going to keep asking. SHA-2 is our standard of keys, for keys. Is that option available in SecAdmin and Landmark? This is
For
over my head.
the encrypt decrypt,
I assume so.
I assume so. For the encrypt decrypt, at this time, only PGP is supported.
Okay. My payroll runs every 2 weeks. What you guys suggested, calculate number of seconds, would not be usable. Is there an alternative? This is right around.
so this would be for as to how to schedule something once a payroll finishes processing. I
Yeah,
would
potentially.
So another option, if you can't count, if you don't want to do that seconds option, counting the number of seconds and deploying a schedule that way, another option would be to run it weekly and then check against your payroll data to see if a specific job has run, maybe query gen. There's also, I forget the table name in payroll.
PR system, and then you look at those run flags.
Yeah, and there's pay dates as well. There's a table that you schedule all your pay dates on. I forget what it is, but you could also check that. And so that your schedule runs once a week, and then your flow, the first thing it does is checks, okay, am I in a pay week scenario? And then so it reads that table and then processes or just aborts.
And another thing that you could do with that, if you're open to it, is use the WFWK screen. When since payroll is so variable, depending on what's going on, and some weeks I close at 3, some weeks I close at 5. Some weeks I close at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's always variable, but and payroll managers love to have more steps added on to their onto their list of things to do because it's already in a 3-ring binder. But if you add one more for the WFWK for them to trigger their flow, and if you have Design Studio, that little example that I showed there is very, very easy to implement.
Even an alternative to the WFWK is if you've got some Perl abilities, you can set up a very simple Perl script that basically just dumps a trigger file to a channel, and then the receiver picks it up and processes it.
Speaking of Design Studio, quick comment. Design Studio is great for a single user. User maintenance across groups of users can be a problem.
User maintenance across groups.
That's all I got. All right, next one. In regards to the triggers for services,
Yes.
the example looked like it was calling S3 VPM.
S3 BPM.
Yeah, is it better
No.
to make the call to S3 for Landmark to pick up, or directly make the call to Landmark to launch the
I
service?
see why you saw that, and I'm gonna go back to the slide. Can you guys get to that? It's like around somewhere in the 20s or 30s as far as the numbers.
Just go back.
Just keep coming back. You got to keep going.
All right, I'll just keep scrolling. Sorry, everybody. You can ask the next one while I
sure.
click the button.
How do you stop the channel from picking up the incoming file before it is fully loaded in the directory? So I guess if it takes a while to load, does the channel just grab it before it's complete?
So if there's a lock on the file, the receiver will not be able to pick it up. But you can also specify a time interval on how often those receivers should actually scan that directory. So you can set it to as low as 1 minute, or you can set it up to whatever you want.
And then you can always take that first node and rename the file that you're processing and put the date and time stamp on it as well. So now I'm going to circle back because I have the slide up here as to it looked like S3.
Yeah.
So I apologize. I should have made that slide a little more clear. But the server URL up there would mean your Landmark server. So let's say I have prod LSF is the name of my LSF server, and prod LM is the name of my Landmark. Then I would use https://prodlandmark.company.com BPM trigger. This is all triggering directly to the Landmark server, which means that you have to make sure that your WebSphere services and everything are running on your Landmark server as well.
Cool. Two more questions here, and we'll call it a wrap. The last two that I have so far. Is Message Builder node recommended in a loop if we have huge data to store in a file?
So if you're writing to an output file, Message Builder can hold a large amount of data. Now, problem with that is if something happens to that process, remember it's all in memory. So if something happens to that process while it's executing, you're going to lose all that in memory. But like I said, there's options there where maybe if it's a 20,000 record file, every 1,000 records you write it out to the file. And then you're doing 20 writes as opposed to 20,000 file writes.
So you can just use a counter.
Last one here. How do I use IPA to update an external variable like a configuration variable? The example is I want to keep a note of the last check number processed by the IPA.
So configuration variables within a configuration set with Landmark can just be updated using a Landmark transaction node, just like any other business class within Landmark.
And that's called, I think the business class is PFI configuration property. So if you drag a landmark transaction onto your palette, and then when you build, you'll go to your data area, and the module is PFI, and then your business class is PFI configuration property. But you would just set up a regular property variable, maybe not in the main configuration set, but in your company's, and then you would just update that configuration property each time you run the flow.
Awesome. So with that,
Those are good questions.
We're going
Thank
to
you.
wrap it up. Thank you very much. I want to thank Mr. Jeff House, Mr. Jeremy Stoltzfus. Great presentation.